Good evening. I'm Philip Gourevitch, a political scientist here at the University of California, San Diego, and once again, your host for The Body Politic. Over the next few months, we'll look at the issues making news in the presidential election. We'll do this by speaking with faculty experts to provide informed and thoughtful analysis of what's being said and done on the campaign trail. Tonight, we'll start with international themes to see how this remarkable campaign is being viewed abroad and what challenges foreign policy poses for the candidates. Joining me are Stephen Haggard, the director of the Korea Pacific Program at the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies here at UCSD. Also with us, Karen Faree, a UCSD political scientist who studies the politics of democracy and the developing countries of Africa. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So I just came back from 2 months in Europe, and I was fascinated by Obama mania over there. First, total fascination with the American campaign, following every word of it, every primary, and complete enthusiasm about Obama. There are opinion polls that showed several countries a lead of 50 to 15 for him. In Belgium, it's something like 72% to 15% to McCain. Tremendous Obama enthusiasm. So Karen, what's your sense about Africa? What is the attitude towards Obama and all of that in Africa?
Oh, I think everything you just said about Europe, you could say 2 times as much about Africa. I mean, first of all, the American campaign is very, very salient in Africa. People are interested in it. The Democratic primary for example, in Kenya, the national papers covered, they had at least one article every day on the Democratic primary. People on the street know the candidates. It's front page news.
And why do you think that is? Why the fascination? Well, first let's talk about Obama. Why the fascination with Obama?
Well, I mean, it's an historic campaign. I mean, to have someone who's of African descent, his father is African, possibly going to be the next president of the United States, has just a very, very powerful symbolism to a lot of people in Africa. And I think a lot of people are just incredulous that this would happen in their lifetime, that they would see an African in this position. So there's just tremendous, tremendous, powerful symbolism involved in Obama's candidacy.
And what about Senator Clinton? What impact did that have? Did they follow that as well? Was that interesting?
I think Africans in general love the Clintons. Bill Clinton was a very popular president in Africa. And Hillary Clinton was very popular also. And so I think there's a lot of support for Hillary Clinton in Africa. I think Obama overshadowed her to a great extent. But I think there's a certain admiration for her, for a woman who fights, a sort of a survivor. People liked that. A lot of women I have talked to have said, you know, there's a lot of powerful symbolism to having a woman be president of the United States also. So there's a lot of positive feeling for Senator Clinton.
And what about the process itself? The 2 people running against each other, talking to each other all the way through. Was that interesting as well?
Well, the primary, as I said, the primary was very heavily covered. The Democratic primary was. The Republican primary, not so much. And so people were interested in this process of how America selects its candidates. And one very interesting anecdote was when Hillary Clinton gave her concession speech. That speech was covered verbatim on page 5 of the Cape Town daily newspaper.
This is in South Africa.
In South Africa. And it was used as an example of being a good loser, how a gracious loser sort of concedes and how she rallies support for the other candidate. And it was used as an example in that way. So very into the process, very
of a democratic process.
Yeah.
Great.
So I thought that was really neat.
Well, Steph, what about Asia? Is there the same Obama mania out there is in Europe and Africa? Or?
Not to the same extent. It's partly perhaps because it's early in the campaign, so we really haven't, the familiarity with the candidates are there. There's some polls that suggest a greater popularity for Obama, but you don't see the same kind of enthusiasm there as in Europe. One reason may be the Iraq War is less salient in the Pacific than it is in Europe. That's obviously just simply getting a new president, a non-Republican president, may resonate with European voters. There's individual connections which are interesting. McCain, of course, has a connection to Vietnam. He was involved in normalization of our relations with Vietnam. But we haven't seen the same kind of enthusiasm in the region, the same kind of Obama mania that you see in Europe and elsewhere.
Well, what do you think are the big issues that Asia poses for the campaign?
Well, the big issue of Asia, of course, is how you think about China. It's become a sort of symbol for so many things in the campaign. It's an economic competitor. Will the rise of China be peaceful? How do you handle the human rights agenda? They're obviously a very large polluter, a contributor to global warming. So there's a complex of issues there that China engages across the two candidates.
Well, what do you think of the landmines for each candidate in that? I mean, what is it about China or the other Asia issues which are potentially problematic for each candidate?
Well, the Republicans and the Democrats have a subtly different approach to Asia. First of all, there's a part of the world where things are going reasonably well for the United States in many ways. I mean, we have the North Korean issue, but prosperous, peaceful overall. The Republican approach to the region tends to emphasize the alliances more, so there's this little edge of containing China, emphasizing our relations with Korea, with Japan, with Australia. And McCain has this extremely interesting idea of forming an alliance of the democracies, which is a completely novel concept. And of course, that would exclude China, include Japan, and also include India, as well as Australia, Korea, and the other democracies of the region. So that's an interesting twist for the region. And I think China feels maybe a little bit uncomfortable for that. On the Obama side, of course, the Democrats historically more interested in human rights issues. And the Chinese press is starting to get a little concerned, perhaps, about the way the Democrats will handle human rights issues, particularly with the Olympics coming up.
And what about trade protectionism for the two candidates?
Well, China, again, there is just an extremely powerful symbol. McCain, much to his credit, in my view, has been very strong and unambiguous about his commitment to free trade. So obviously the Asian countries have to be quite happy about that. Obama states a preference for free trade, but always rings it with some qualifications. He's against the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, which is obviously very important for at least some of the Korean electorate. And his trade positions obviously would not sit as comfortably as the unambiguous McCain commitment.
And how does Korea fit into the campaign?
Interesting. This is one that may not get solved by the time the Bush administration leaves office. The North Koreans seem to be dragging their feet at the moment, so this is going to be on the desk of both. The comment that Obama would speak to, meet with any foreign leader has of course been picked up in the region. And there's a speculation about whether he would meet with Kim Jong-il, for example. McCain, very tough on the North Korean issue, and actually even critical of what the Bush administration has been doing. So he's attacking the Bush process on North Korea from the right.
Mm-hmm. So as you read these candidates, does one of them seem more internationalist than the other, or one of them more? I mean, the categories that we hear when we read are things like unilateral, multilateral institutions. What role do they give to multilateral institutions or not? Do you see a difference between these candidates on that score?
Well, I think they're both internationalist in their own ways. I mean, obviously Obama is concerned with a set of domestic issues and will certainly run largely on a domestic platform, in part because of the way the economy is performing, in part because he may be at some disadvantage in projecting toughness vis-a-vis McCain. But Obama is very committed to multilateralism, the idea of multilateral cooperation as a way of bringing China in to the international system. And of course, this League of Democracies idea is multilateral, but it excludes one of the main players in the region, China.
Well, so we've talked about how the popularity of these candidates in foreign countries. So as Americans, should we care about that? Does it matter? Karen, I mean, if you're an electorate, if you're talking to friends, and does it matter when you're an American voter that you should be thinking about whether that he's popular in Africa? Does that make any difference for the future of our country?
Well, I think there's hard power and soft power in the world, and I think the image of the country affects our soft power, you know, and when we have a leader that is interesting and exciting and evokes sort of more positive feelings in the international community, then that can be something definitely to our benefit. And I think, at least in Africa, Obama has the potential to really change how people think about the United States. There's a lot of skepticism that he won't get elected because the United States is a very racist country to a lot of Africans. They believe we are racist, that whites will not vote for this man. So I think that if he were to be elected, it would really change, it would have a very powerful effect on the American image abroad, and that could be a good thing for the soft power side of American foreign power.
Well, what are the issues about American foreign policy towards Africa that you think matter? What are the important policy issues to confront the United States about Africa?
Well, right now there's a big issue brewing where there's the military in Africa has sort of 3 bases, and there's an effort to unify them in a single base and have it located somewhere in Africa. And there isn't a lot of popular...
Explain that for a minute. The military bases of what exactly?
The American military.
Oh, the American military bases,
right.
I'm sorry. Okay,
have a unified base in Africa on the ground somewhere. And people in Africa are not really very excited about having a big American base somewhere. So that's an issue that is important. I think even more important is the war on terror, particularly in East Africa. The United States has been very focused on the war on terror and has developed friendships with African leaders based on their ability to help the United States in the war on terror, less their domestic popularity or whether or not they're good leaders. And so I think there's some belief that if Obama became the president, that there would be a little less willingness to sacrifice other issues in sort of a single-minded pursuit of that one.
And those other issues are what, democratization and things like that, or foreign aid or trade? What are the issues that they think the United States is neglecting because of the preoccupation with the war on terror?
I think a certain willingness to support leaders who are not very good leaders, who are maybe economically corrupt and who have had domestic abuses or have not been very good Democrats, so to speak. The United States is more concerned about whether a particular leader is going to help in the war on terror.
I mean, right now we're talking to each other here in the middle of June, and there are some elections coming up in Kenya and Zimbabwe that are important. Are we getting some blame for that? Are we seen as taking bad positions on what's happening in those countries? Or?
Well, the Kenyan election was in December, and I think there's a certain amount of the election was very flawed. Kibaki won the election officially, but many people believe he stole the election. And Kibaki remains a very good friend of the United States. So I think people have read between the lines on that one a little bit.
Yeah. So Steph, what about in Asia? I mean, does it matter to America what the Asians think of our leader? Should we care which of these people is well-liked or not liked in Asia?
That itself is a partisan question, actually, because I think well, I mean, to a certain extent, I think the Bush administration from very early on said that it didn't matter. And that, the president was the president of the United States, not the president of the rest of the world. And I think he was actually on record of saying something to that effect. There was a pretty dramatic fall off in support for the United States in the year or so after 9/11, particularly in Southeast Asia, to a lesser extent in other parts of the region, not as dramatic as in Europe. And now you see a little bit coming back, a little bit more positive image of the United States, for example, in Japan, even in Korea, despite the recent protests in China, a kind of increase in the positive views of the United States. And I agree with Karen. I think that's something that helps our diplomacy. If there's a positive image there, it's easier for us to get public support for what we want to do.
Well, what do we need their help for?
Well, the terrorism issue is less central than it was. The two core terrorist sort of centers of terrorist activity in Southeast Asia aren't exhibiting the same kind of activity they did. That's been resolved. So I think the new issues are really part of what the policy space is going to be about. issues like global warming. Obviously, the Indians and the Chinese are going to be central to putting together a post-Kyoto world and managing global warming. Non-proliferation issues involve the cooperation of other parties. We need the help of China, we need the help of Japan, we need the help of South Korea to manage the North Korean nuclear issue. So there are a series of issues that involve cooperation, that require cooperation from Asian parties if we're going to get our own way.
Right. Well, say some more about Japan. We haven't talked much about that. We are all old enough to remember when the dominant issues, and if this had been 15 years ago and we had been discussing Asia, it would have been Japan. Now a lot of our conversation is China, Korea, India to some degree. What about Japan? What are our relations with Japan? And what?
Very interesting. So to some extent, the discussion we have about China is a replay of the discussion we had about Japan. It's the same issues of competitiveness, this rising power, and so forth. But Japan has gone through an extremely interesting transformation in its foreign policy. It's becoming more like a normal country. And the debate is becoming more about
you got to explain that's a special.
Sure.
Japan as a normal country is a special term, so explain that, right? Yeah.
So Japan has historically spent about 1% of its GDP on defense. This is extraordinarily low.
Officially.
Well, even by most accounts. It's a low spending country. It's, and of course, for critics of the alliance, they argue that Japan has been a free rider. But in the last 4 or 5 years, and particularly under the Koizumi administration, there's really been an effort to take a more forward posture in international relations, including at the military level. They contributed forces to Afghanistan. They committed forces to Iraq. They've been involved in peacekeeping. They've been involved in a quite extended arms buildup, in part out of concern with China. So Japan is in a very uneasy position, redefining its foreign policy at the moment, and facing the rise of China much more proximate than for us. Yeah.
So let's, one more question that I really want to spend a little bit of time on is, so Obama says he'll talk to people. He'll talk to the president of Iran. He'll talk to I don't know what he said about the president of North Korea. Anything wrong with that? Why not? All he says is he talked to them. He's not saying what he'd say. So is that a subject that deserves controversy? It's getting controversy. Does it matter?
I think if Obama had his way, he would probably roll that back, as they say, because I think the McCain campaign is going to hit him with it. Why should Obama meet with Kim Jong-il, this dictator who starves his people? So I think there's going to be, McCain is going to come out swinging with that point. I'm not sure what a McCain-Kim Jong-il conversation would look like.
Or Obama,
Obama conversation would look like. I mean, what would be the purpose? So I suspect that what Obama will say is, well, I didn't mean that I would meet with them at any time. We would have to negotiate other issues first, only when it was in our interest. So I suspect he's going to have to back away from that, but McCain's going to do his best to make sure he can.
How do you think that plays in Africa, Karen, this idea of saying I'll talk to anybody at any time?
I think if anything, it's probably positive because African countries are the ones on the outside who don't get an audience with the American president every time they want to. And this is sort of a different image of openness to talking to people. I think on the other hand, Africans are somewhat skeptical that changing the president will really change the way America works. So I think they would like it if the American president were open to talking to them. But
Well, so in Africa, what is it that could happen? What would America do? What would any president do that would persuade Africans that something had changed? Because in a way, what you're saying, it doesn't matter who you elect. We don't really believe it's going to make any difference to what you do.
Well, I think the reason why they're skeptical that a leadership change would matter is because they think the United States pursues its own interests abroad, and that's a normal thing for a country to do. So to put other countries ahead of its own interests would certainly send that signal, but I don't think anyone would really expect that. So.
Well, that's a great way to end. I mean, I think that's a challenge for us to think about what would be different in the foreign policy behavior of the United States and what would make other countries, because we're talking about the image of these people and the symbolism of who they are as opposed to actual behaviors. Well, thanks to both of you. We have to stop with that. Up next, the infamous U.S. soldiers turned photographers at Abu Ghraib are presented in detail in the new book and movie, Standard Operating Procedure. I had a chance to speak with the book's author and also my cousin, Philip Gourevitch, when he was in San Diego on book tour earlier this month.
4 years ago, when the photographs of American soldiers abusing Iraqi prisoners in Saddam Hussein's old torture chambers at Abu Ghraib prison, because this prison had been the centerpiece of Saddam's reign of repression. These photographs were released here. They came out on 60 Minutes and the New Yorker. And I was, at the time, covering the presidential election, the 2004 race for the New Yorker, and I assumed that they would become a major occasion for national debate. It was clear at the time that although there were aspects of personal excess and strange group dynamics depicted in these photographs with some of the soldiers posing next to the prisoners, that a lot of what you saw in those prisoners, the use of dogs to make them afraid and to attack them when they were chained to their cages naked, the keeping of prisoners naked, hooded, and long periods in isolation, that these were matters of national policy. The administration quickly tried to make that sound like a partisan position, but here was The Economist magazine, a magazine that supported the invasion of Iraq and many aspects of it as the invasion went on, saying Rumsfeld resign on its cover, making the clear connection between the highest levels of the American government and the actions of these lowest level soldiers as a matter of policy. And it seemed to me that in an election where the president who had started the war was up for re-election, and where the war at that point was not going quite according to plan, and it was clear that whatever the war had been about in the first place, it was now about the fact that we were there. And it was about America's projection of its image and its force into the world. And why was this the image that we wanted to project? Why, after several centuries of American identity being wrapped up in the idea that this is the one thing we don't do as a matter of policy, is to torture, that this is something that does distinguish us, that this is something that attracts the rest of the world to us even as we struggle with it to assert our values or so. Why were we reversing these things? Is this who we want to be? Never happened. And then in the aftermath of the release of the photographs, there was a kind of remarkable and very steady flood of documents from people in government who had been on the losing side of the debate against torture. They had been against it, and they had watched the administration make this the policy of our nation. And they started to leak documents more and more to the press, and you started to be able to see in numerous reports through this rather legalistic paperwork how it had come to be this way. And yet that story, in a strange way, didn't include us. It didn't involve us. It didn't connect us. And it felt always abstract and distant.
To us, you mean the American public? And
yeah, it was very hard to kind of feel a connection between these very abstract legal papers where people are arguing about the exact definition of torture and the exact limitations of pain and so forth, and the experience of this war, which so few Americans, in fact, have a direct involvement in. And then Errol Morris, whom I'd known for years, the filmmaker, started sending me transcripts of interviews he was conducting with the people who took and appeared in these photographs. This was about summer of 2006. And immediately I heard a sound of American soldiers' voices speaking directly about their experience, describing the experience at the prison in ways that nothing in the photographs had led me to anticipate, making me rethink a lot and to feel it more directly, to see them as figures both of our national drama, and also to see how unheard and unseen they had in fact been, and how poorly we understood it. And I felt this I can work with.
Well, we'll say more just about that, about this gap between how we respond to the photos and what you were experiencing and listening to the voices of these people. I mean, we have this idea that photos, a picture's worth 1,000 words.
These photographs were different from almost all the other kinds of photographs we have that define the major historical events of our times to us. Iconic photographs, if you will. They weren't taken by professional photographers. They weren't taken by journalists. If a journalist had taken these pictures, they would have got a Pulitzer Prize or it would have been considered one of the great scoops of our times. But the whole point is they couldn't have. These were things that were being done in secret. And so the photographs offered us, in a sense, an expose, but was it intended? How were they intended? What were they meant to do?
How should we think about, the terrible things were going on, are they responsible for this? Are they Is it are soldiers doing these terrible things as individuals? How would you frame to us how to think about that?
I think about the story of Abu Ghraib and the story that the book tells as essentially a war story. In the old-fashioned sense, you get a group of young people, and they're sent into a situation that's much vaster than they are, and they have a very narrow group view of it. If you want to take an image from digital photography, they're a pixel in a gigantic drama that involves people in Washington and people in caves in Afghanistan and history of centuries and so forth. And almost everybody's got hundreds of years of different history that they're dragging into this. They go into this and they're thinking about what to do. And they're sent to a prison that we learn a lot about as we talk to them, that it was in a combat zone. It was at the heart of the Sunni Triangle during the high part of the insurgency when it was in the Sunni Triangle in the fall of 2003. So it's being shelled constantly. It's a terrifying place. It's overcrowded with prisoners, 70, 80, 90% of whom may never have done anything related to the insurgency, but were simply rounded up in security sweeps and dumped here like in a concentration camp. They're terrified, they're untrained as guards, and they're suddenly put in a place where this is the high-value detainee military intelligence block. And so telling this story through their experiences as they come in and they look around and they say, Sarge, why are all these people naked? Sarge, why do they have panties on their head? Why are they in stress positions with their hands bound behind their backs, made to stand for hours? Why are we being made to keep them up all night? And they start meeting these military intelligence guys, CIA interrogators and contract interrogators who say, this is what you're supposed to do. It's to help break them. It's to prepare them for interrogation. It's to help extract information from them.
So your argument is that the people at the very top, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz,
and all the way in between. Right. I don't think it's just sort of the very high layer and the very bottom layer. There's a kind of cowing, political cowing and corrupting of the military that takes place, where all along the chain, people kind of knuckle under. It's a bureaucracy. People see which way the wind's blowing. And it was no longer the Iraq War. It was the global war on terror in their minds, and anything was justified. And the soldiers were told this.
Right. So responsibility goes to the very top.
Absolutely.
If you'd like to see the entire interview with Philip Gourevitch, go to our website at ucsd.tv. That wraps up this edition of The Body Politic. Join us next month for a discussion of the politics of immigration. Until then, I'm Peter Gourevitch. Thank you and good night.